whispers crawl beneath the skin, a shadow's grin.
The forest that remembers. Baron Hadran stood on the rise, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Before him stretched the Oldwood, a sea of tangled green and deep shadow that swallowed the morning light. Behind him, the ordered fields of his estate lay like a patchwork quilt, neat and obedient. The contrast was an offense to his eyes. "It is a waste," he said, his voice a low rumble. His steward, Lem, stood a respectful step behind, clutching a ledger. Good soil, they say, beneath that root-cluttered floor. Land that could feed 100 families lies fallow under superstition. "The men, my lord," Lem ventured, his eyes darting towards the tree line. "They speak of the Oldwood's temper." "Foolishness," Hadran snapped. He was a man carved from practicality, his face lined with the winds of management, not mystery. "They speak of shade and strange sounds. A forest is a forest. It has trees. We need farmland. The equation is simple." The woodsmen gathered at the forest's edge were a grim, silent lot. They were men who knew the bite of an axe handle and the sigh of a falling pine. But here their tools seemed clumsy in their hands. They did not look at the dense wall of oak, yew, and thorn. They listened to it. The Oldwood was never silent. It creaked. It whispered with the passage of creatures unseen. It held a damp, mossy breath that felt older than the barony, older than the kingdom. Hadran addressed them, his voice cutting through the humid air. "The boundary is marked. You will clear west from the stream, 100 paces deep by week's end. Double pay for double yield." A man named Kale, whose beard was gray with years of resin and sawdust, spat on the ground. "The old ones marked this wood for a reason, my lord. It's not for the cutting." "The old ones are dust," Hadran said, his patience thinning, "and their reasons died with them. Begin." The first axe blow, when it finally came, sounded like a profanity. The solid asterisk thunk against the ancient bark was too sharp, too final. The woodsmen flinched as one. The forest seemed to inhale. Then the work began in earnest. The first day was a trial of muscle and will. The trees were stubborn, their wood dense and twisted. The undergrowth clung with thorny fingers. The men worked in pairs, speaking little, their laughter strained. They felt watched. It was a common enough feeling in deep woods, but here it was a palpable pressure, a weight in the air between the towering trunks. As the sun began to sink, painting the clearing in long, distorted shadows, young Edric dropped his axe. A sharp, choked cry escaped him. He stumbled back from the half-cut yew tree, his face as pale as birch bark, pointing a trembling finger into the deepening gloom between the trees. "What is it, boy?" Kale growled, hefting his own axe. "A rider," Edric whispered, his voice cracking. "A knight, but he was bones, and his horse. Its eyes were hollow coals. It charged me. I heard its hooves like stones on stone." The others gathered, peering into the twilight. They saw only shadows upon shadows, the intricate lattice of branch and vine. There was no sound but the evening wind stirring the high leaves and their own rapid breaths. "Rum and fear," Hadran declared, having walked down from the rise to inspect the progress. He looked at the pitifully small patch of cleared ground, littered with chips and leaves, and then at Edric's terror-stricken face. "You saw a deer, startled by your hacking, or nothing at all. Go back to the camp, sleep it off. The rest of you, tomorrow we start at dawn." But Edric did not sleep it off. He sat by the fire, shivering despite the heat, staring into the flames as if seeing something else within them. He would not speak of it again, but his hands would not stop shaking. The unraveling began in earnest on the second day. The woodsmen pressed further in, the wound in the forest's flank growing wider. The stump stood like raw, forgotten teeth. The air in the clearing felt wrong, too open, too bright, a blasphemy against the natural gloom. It was Tomas who fell next, a burly man, quiet and steady. He was hauling a cut branch when he suddenly gagged, dropping the wood to clutch at his throat. A wet, gurgling sound bubbled from his lips. He collapsed to his knees, eyes wide with an agony that had no source. The men rushed to him, but he batted their hands away, his own fingers scrabbling at his unmarked neck. For 10 seconds he knelt there, suffocating on open air, feeling the searing, impossible pain of a puncture, the hot gush of blood down his mail, the metallic taste filling his mouth. Then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. He drew in a ragged, desperate breath, his tunic whole, his skin untouched. But the terror in his eyes was a fresh, deep wound. "What happened?" Cale demanded, helping him to his feet. "An arrow," Tomas rasped, his voice hoarse. "A damned Saxon arrow. I felt the fletching. I felt it." He looked around at the confused, frightened faces. "You didn't see, you didn't hear the war cry." There was only the sound of the forest, but it felt different now. The rustle of leaves seemed to carry whispers, not of words, but of emotions, panic, rage, final despair. Hadran was informed. He examined Tomas, finding nothing. A fit, he concluded, though his own certainty was beginning to wear thin. The heat, the strain, send him to the village. But Tomas refused to go back into the trees. He sat at the edge of the clearing, a hollow man, jumping at every bird call. The incidents were no longer isolated. A woodsman named Ulrich leaped back from a thicket, screaming, his arms flailing as if fending off beasts. Deep, burning lines of pain scored his back and shoulders, though his shirt was unripped. He wept, babbling about yellow eyes and the smell of wet fur and his own blood. Another, a boy of 16, suddenly froze, staring at his hands which were clean, but which he saw as blackened, blistered claws. He smelled roasting meat and heard his own screams echo from a long-ago fire. The work slowed to a standstill. The men huddled together, axes held like talismans, not tools. They spoke in hushed tones of the echoes. They had a name for it now. The forest was showing them its memories. Every death it had ever witnessed, man, woman, beast, was stored in its roots, in its sap, in the very air between its boughs. And their cutting, their violent reshaping, was stirring those memories, making them bleed into the present. Hadran's fury was a cold, brittle thing. He stood in the shrinking camp, the fearful eyes of his men upon him. "Phantoms," he spat, "shadows on the mind. You are giving power to your own fears. The trees are just trees. They fall, they burn, they become houses and ships. That is their purpose." An old woman from the nearby village came then. She was not invited. She simply appeared at the edge of the camp, leaning on a gnarled stick, her eyes milky but seeing too much. The men crossed themselves or made older signs against evil. "Baron," she called, her voice like dry leaves. Hadran turned, his impatience a visible aura. "What do you want, crone? I have no time for charms or curses." "The Oldwood is not for you," she said, ignoring his tone. "It is a memory of stone and sap. It does not think as you think, it feels. It remembers the first acorn that fell here. It remembers the tread of the great, shaggy beasts that are now stone in the hills. It remembers every drop of blood ever spilled on its floor." "Superstition," Hadran said, but he did not look away from her clouded eyes. "You cut into it," she continued, as if he had not spoken. "You cut into its flesh, and like any living thing that is cut, it flinches, it lashes out, but its weapon is not tooth or claw. Its weapon is all the pain it has ever known. "You are not fighting monsters, my lord. You are drowning in a sea of forgotten agony. Stop before it drowns you." She turned and shuffled away, leaving a deeper silence than before. Hadran stared after her, then at the dark tree line. The cleared patch was a scar, yes, but it was his scar, his will upon the world. To retreat now was to admit that the world of shadows and whispers held more power than his title, his steel, his logic. "We continue," he said, his voice flat. "Tomorrow I lied." The dawn of the third day was the color of a bruise. Hadran, armed with a woodsman's axe more symbolic than useful, led a sullen party of his most loyal, or most desperate, men back into the clearing. The stumps seemed to watch them. The air was thick and still, holding its breath. For an hour they worked in a tense silence, broken only by the chop of axes. The forest was quiet, ominously so. Even the ever-present whispers in the leaves had ceased. It was a listening silence. Then Kale, swinging his axe at a stubborn root, froze. The tool fell from his numb fingers. "Do you hear that?" he murmured. At first there was nothing. Then a low rumble, not from the sky but from the earth, a vibration through the soles of their boots, a distant metallic clank, a shout swallowed by distance, then another. The sounds grew, swelling from the forest itself, from the very air. The clash of iron on iron, the wet thud of iron on flesh, screams not of terror but of battle rage and death agony. The men dropped their tools, clustering together, their backs to the center of the clearing. Hadran stood his ground, axe raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. The clearing did not change. The trees stood where they stood. The sky remained above, but now it was filled with ghosts. Phantom shapes flickered at the edges of vision. A shield wall materialized in the mist between the oaks, glittering one moment, translucent the next. A horse and rider, both shimmering like heat haze, charged through the space where Tomas stood. He cried out, feeling the gust of the passing, feeling the spray of phantom mud. The air grew thick with the smells of sweat and blood and churned earth and fear. "This isn't real," Hadran roared, but his voice was lost under the cacophony of a forgotten battle. An axeman, his face a snarling mask of blue woad, swung a ghostly blade at Kale. The old woodsman did not flinch, but a line of cold fire opened across his chest, and he gasped, stumbling back, his hand pressed to unbroken skin. The woodsmen broke. They fled, stumbling over roots in their own fear, scrambling back towards the light and safety of the open fields. Hadran shouted after them, but the words were stolen by a phantom war horn. And then he was alone. The silent, watching forest was gone. In its place was the full, brutal memory of a field of slaughter. He stood in the midst of it. He saw men grappling in the mud, dying slowly, quickly, messily. He felt the concussion of blows through the earth. The screaming was inside his skull. A king, his crown askew, his mail rent, stumbled backwards through the clearing, a spear lodged in his side. His regal face was twisted in shock and pain. He fell to his knees not 3 paces from Hadran and looked up, his eyes meeting the Baron's. They were not ghostly eyes. They were human, full of the profound confusion of mortality. A shadow fell over him. A warrior with a notched sword raised it high. Hadran felt it, the cold intrusion of steel into his own abdomen, a bursting, tearing agony that robbed him of breath, of thought, of everything but pain. He looked down, expecting to see a blade, but there was only his own fine tunic, whole and clean. Yet the pain was absolute, filling him, ending him. He tasted blood in his mouth. He felt the chill of death spreading from his gut. The Phantom King gasped his last and faded. Hadran fell to his own knees, retching, clutching his stomach. The pain faded, leaving a searing memory etched into his nerves. Before he could recover, the scene shifted again. The heat came first, a dry, raging heat that replaced the battle's chill. The trees at the edge of the clearing were not trees anymore, they were pillars of flame. A wall of fire roared through the understory, a memory of a lightning strike or a careless campfire from centuries past. He heard the panic of animals, the shriek of foxes, the blind flight of deer. He felt the searing kiss of the flames on his own skin. His hands blistered. His breath scalded his lungs. He smelled his own hair burning. He was a creature of pure terror, trapped in an elemental furnace. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the remembered fire. He collapsed, rolling on the ground, which was cool and damp with moss, but to him it was embers and ash. Then silence. A deep, profound, and merciful silence. He lay on the real forest floor, panting, his body whole, his clothes unburnt. Tears cut clean lines through the dirt on his face. The clearing was just a clearing again, littered with tools and fresh stumps. The Oldwood stood around him, silent, watchful, immense. He understood now. The crone was right. This was not hatred. This was not the attack of a malevolent spirit. It was defense, the most profound defense imaginable. They were not cutting trees. They were cutting into a living library of death, a cathedral of final moments, and the library was reading its most terrible stories back to them. He got to his feet slowly, every joint aching with a pain that was not physical. He walked out of the clearing, past the abandoned axes, past the boundary marked by his own men. He did not look back. The men found him at the camp, sitting on a stool, staring at his hands. He looked up and they recoiled from what they saw in his eyes. He had aged a decade in an hour. The practicality was gone, burned away, replaced by a hollow, awestruck dread. "The clearing stops," he said, his voice raw. "No more axes touch the Oldwood, not a branch, not a twig." There was no argument. But Hadran did not simply withdraw. A profound, twisted sense of penance took root in his shattered soul. He had opened a wound. He must try to mend it. The next day he commanded his men, not with tools of destruction, but with spades and saplings. He ordered a nursery of fast-growing thorn, ash, and rowan. He personally led the planting, not a defensive palisade, but a living, growing ring around the entire contested border of the Oldwood. A buffer, an apology in wood and leaf. From this day, he proclaimed to his confused tenants and soldiers, "The Oldwood is under my protection. It is not to be entered. It is not to be hunted. It is not to be touched." He enforced this new law with a fanatical zeal that dwarfed his former obsession with clearance. A poacher caught snaring rabbits within sight of the trees was publicly flogged, not for stealing game, but for disturbing the memory. A woodcutter who took a fallen branch from the outer ring for kindling had his hut burned. Hadran became a figure of fear again, but of a different kind. He was no longer the stern, practical lord. He was the haunted guardian, a man who paced the new-grown hedge, his eyes forever turned inward to the deep green gloom, listening to whispers only he could now truly hear. Years folded into one another. The new ring of trees grew tall and thick, weaving into a natural wall. The Oldwood, left to itself, seemed to breathe more easily. The sense of watchful anger abated, replaced by its old, deep, eternal presence. Hadran aged. His hair turned white. He spent less time in his manor and more in a simple hut near the forest edge. He spoke little, and when he did, it was often about the quiet times in the wood or the weight of years in a particular oak. One autumn morning, a woodsman, the grandson of Kale, who now told the story of the echoes as a fireside tale, found the old baron. He was lying on a bed of moss at the very edge of the protective hedge, where the cultivated trees met the ancient wild ones. He was on his back, looking up at the canopy where the leaves were turning to gold and fire. A look of peaceful recognition was on his face, as if he had finally seen an old, long-expected friend. There was no mark on him. He was simply gone. They buried him where he lay, as his final, whispered instructions had commanded. It was not a lord's burial, but a quiet one. They placed no stone. The winter passed, harsh and cold. When spring returned, softening the earth, a curious sapling pushed its way through the soil of Baron Hadran's grave. It grew with unnatural speed. Its bark was not smooth, but textured, wrinkled like the skin of an old man who had spent his life squinting at distant horizons. Its leaves, when they unfurled, were a deep, glossy green, and when the wind stirred them, they did not rustle like ordinary leaves. They whispered. It was a soft, sighing sound, not of pain or battle, but of weary vigilance, of a long watch finally coming to an end. The new tree took its place among the others. The protective hedge thickened, and the old wood, the vast, ancient memory of stone and sap, stood silent and deep, holding within its boundless, quiet heart one more story. The story of the man who tried to cut it down and who, in the end, became a part of its forever.
Shadows